Greetings. What's going on, everybody? First off, I do want to apologize for not dropping this video earlier yesterday. But with that, I'm gonna make up for it today. And the first book we're gonna be reading out of is the Yamassee War. We're gonna do jumping reading between these three books: the Yamassee War, the Yamassee Indians from Florida to South Carolina, and the Invention of the Creek Nation, because I want to shine some light or some details on who actually went to war and who were the allies of the British and who was the people that was actually fighting against the British. Now, contemporary dates for the Yamassee War is 1715 to about 1717 or 1728, depending on different scholars. But what I'm telling you, or what I'm going to tell you and show you, is that the way that the Yamassee were treated, it lets you know that there was war, acts of war before 1715, and this carried on to what we currently know through the Guale Wars onto the Seminole Wars. So I'm just going to show you how the war really didn't end. It just changed names, and that's the same thing that happened to the Yamassee. Like, they didn't just lose or they didn't just disappear. The British had a big hand in changing these people's names to remove them from war. On the next page, he's basically talking about post-war, and he says in what might be called the first phase of post-war violence, Yamassees made incursions into South Carolina to attack plantations and liberate slaves who were now living on lands some Yamassee still considered to be theirs. So you all were creating slave plantations on people's lands, and they have families there, or you're bringing people over here. So they're like, you know what? We finna go over there and raid these and get these people up off these plantations. While speaking on alliances, let's see who the Yamassee were starting to align themselves with. So in 1706, it says the Spaniards at St. Augustine joined the French, and they basically made up a fleet, and they were selling to go to war, but it was 800 men. They had whites, Mustees, and Negroes, and 200 Indians to invade the province. They basically were going back and forth with South Carolina. There was an issue between St. Augustine and South Carolina. Now it says, this reference to Mustees again recognizes the Indian African intermix common in Spanish worlds. So many people want to deny the mixture between different African groups and the Yamassee. Okay? Now, one thing is, on page 168, it basically says that there was an African man who ended up marrying, he was baptized, he became Catholic, but he was baptized and ended up marrying an Indian woman. And even though they claimed that he had slaves, he was not returning them to Carolina or to other places because, again, to him, these were not slaves. Now, the next important thing that it does say, it says, despite some initial success, this retaliatory expedition failed. But once again, blacks and Indians in Carolina would have learned more about the multiracial military of Spanish Florida and the Anglo-Spanish enmity that offered them an alternative alliance. And it's also stated that the Carolina Raiders, they would use blacks and their Indian groups to go enslave other groups. Now, some Yamassee did take on Africans or people that were considered black to actually go enslave other people or take them and sell them to Carolina. The journals of the commoners, you actually can find a lot of notes in there. It deals with commerce, so it can show you different businesses or different receipts that or payments that were made between the Indians or the Yamassee and those in South Carolina. Now, one thing that is important here, right? The Altamahawk King, what they call him, he and his people were upset that there was a man, Alexander Nicholas, and he beat a woman And he basically beat her to death. And when he beat her, her baby died within her. And this was going on often. See, while you read this particular text, I have it here in my notes. We're going to count together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. The enslavement of women and children is mentioned on 16 different pages in this particular book. So we know where this is starting to go on, is leading up towards battle. A host of these allies, black slaves, it says they continued to run from South Carolina. And it was possible they were treated even more brutally by these traders than were the Yamassee. After an alleged slave conspiracy in 1711, Carolinas enacted a harsh new slave code in 1712 that permitted planters to punish slaves using mutilations, like castration and amputation, and also execution. So we're building something up. You're messing with our women, you're playing with our money, and you're killing my brother. So Jane Landon, she basically said what the elders say. In this book they had to actually go sit by these people. But it says, on April 14, 1715, that slave prophet's dire prediction seemed to have come true. In an effort to resolve long simmering tensions and hostilities with their Yamassee trading partners, Carolina's Indian commissioners sent a delegation to Portocalago. Among them were the traders William Bray, who had tricked some of his runaway slaves to St. Augustine earlier in the year, Thomas Nairn, Samuel Warner, John Cochran, and John Wright, against whom the Yamassee had filed numerous complaints. The Yamassee at Portocalago received the traders and even feasted with them the night before on Good Friday. It's the weekend of Easter. They launched a well-coordinated attack against their English oppressors. Painted in red and black stripes for war and death, the Yamassee and other Indians who joined the war killed 90 English traders over the course of the war, including traders John Wright, John Ruffy, and John Cochran. And they tortured Thomas Nairn for 3 days, burning lightwood splinters under his skin until he expired. So Stephen Hahn here, what he's saying in July 1715, he's speaking on more fighting, more ongoing. So what he says is that at one point about 500 Yamassee actually overran 20 plantations. They burnt 20 plantations. They burnt down churches. The guy, what's his name, William Treadwell, they basically made it hard on him, right? But it also says the Yamassee also killed cattle and horses that the people might have used. So it's letting them know, like, anything that was oppressing us or anything that you brought over here, that's getting wiped out. We're gonna cleanse. They were doing a complete cleansing of the land. Now, there was a reverend, and this particular reverend, what he stated is, he said in his words that the Yamassee War was God's punishment to the traders for the abuse of the impoverished Yamassee, and for the planters, especially horrific abuse of their African slaves. My favorite part about this is, recently we have a lot of people that's denying the African slave trade. But let's see what the tribes have to say about the people that are Africans that were here. It says, recognizing the chance for their own liberation, enslaved Africans living nearby joined in the Yamassee uprising. Unwilling to recognize such agency, Carolinas reported that their slaves had been taken. So in order to get people to help them, assist them in this war, because as we can see, they were starting to get their behind handed to them, they had to start writing that, hey, these people are coming on our land, taking our slaves, burning our plantations, and we've done nothing to them, when that was not the case. So here's a quick quote of that, right? So he's talking about Spanish. He says, their refusal to deliver up these slaves has encouraged a great many more likely to run away to that place, speaking of Florida. Now, he said that the Spanish are barbarians because they suffer the Yamassee. That basically they take them in. But they also keep white women and children as slaves among them. Of course, You enslaved our women and our children. Now we burnt those plantations and took your women and children. You have a problem with it. One chief, Pedro Bravo, now he seen it as the slaughter of the English was self-defense, because he says that they were taking Yamassee children from their parents and shipping them away to be sold. So he didn't say they were selling them on the land. They were taking these women, taking their children from them, and then shipping them across the water to other islands, other places, maybe even other continents, because we know a lot of Yamassee are in Africa or in Europe because they were shipped out. Two things to touch on page 175 is, one is that before the war kicked off, the men made sure they hid their women and their children good enough so when the fighting started, they wouldn't be involved in these fights. And it also lets you know that, I love how they use this term. Excuse me. So it says, this reference to blacks and mulattoes confirms King Jospo's testimony some 20 years later that Africans, like other indigenous groups, had been incorporated into the multicultural Yamassee Confederacy prior to their removal to Florida. Interesting. The reputedly warlike Yamassee must have recognized and respected the military skills of these escaped slaves, as did the Spanish, who formed them to frontier militias. In this manner, the Mandinga men, who became Francisco Menendez and led the first free black town in what is today the United States. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and touch on Uncle Menendez. But something's big here is speaking on the 32,000 allies or indigenous allies of Spain. So it still was a lot of people here. But let's go ahead and see who Menendez is. Now, there was always a problem with South Carolina and their documents. Somebody was always, quote unquote, stealing their slaves, but in reality, these people were getting up out of enslavement and going to be with people that accepted them for them. And Menendez, when he put in his petition to make sure that he was considered free, it actually was stamped by a Yamassee chief. And this is the same chief that led the Yamassee War and let them know, hey, look, he may be a slave to you, but to us, he has a form of autonomy, right? So he has the right to walk this land, to live this land, to eat, basically to self-govern. He's his own man. They are their own people. But, the outsiders didn't view it that way. One thing dealing with Menendez is he wasn't an ordinary guy. So we know that he was Mandinka, and he linked with the Yamassee to fight the English. But in his town that he set up in Florida, you also had people that we would consider today Congolese. So you had people from the Congo also. So this was a man who was about unification of individuals and nation building. So how can you deny the African slave trade when this man right here put his life on the line for that? All of my people that do Ifa, Santeria, I'm going to use this as the clip. But y'all going to like this. Check this out. Now, again, forgive my dialect. So it says, La Caridad de Crumbre was instilled as the black patron saint of Cuba, whose miraculous discovery was attributed to two Cuban Indians and an African who were fishing together, and was also the secret symbol for Oshun, the Yoruba goddess of fertility. Says that Reyes prayed to her on such an important issue, offers tangible proof to the cultural assimilation between Africans and Yamassees on the Florida frontier. So it says, over the next 2 decades, Africans and Indians reinforced their military, political, and socio-cultural ties, some of which had origins stretching back to Carolina. So this just wasn't about a Florida thing. But it also says that they formed families together. I cannot make this up. So it also lets you know that if you look in the Spanish records, that they showed that there were what they call interracial marriages between Africans and different groups of indigenous women. It also says that these marriages became more fluent with African men and indigenous women in 1670. So from 1640 up to about 1707, we can actually find or put hands on documents of their interactions and actually of them getting married. Here's one example. There's a drummer, it says Francisco Joseph, the drummer and black slave of Captain Antonio de Arguelles, excuse me if I botched his name, married Michaela, a native of Mayaca. Now, let's not forget, in the last video I explained who was in Mayaca, what particular group of people actually lived there. There's this priest, he's marrying a supposed to be slave and a indigenous woman. But this is what he says. He says, marrying Spaniards, blacks, or mulattoes, slowly their children will stop being Indians. Listen to that. Marrying Spanish, blacks, or mulattoes, their children will stop being Indians. So it says, and more easily enter into the true knowledge of the mysteries of our Catholic faith. So they needed or wanted these women to mix in with other men because these men were now teaching their traditions and their religions and their spiritual systems when you would usually get that from your mother. Lastly, with Menendez, after the war and after Spanish Florida was sold, he actually received the ship and they went back to Cuba. They went not back, but they went to Cuba. Some of them went back to Cuba because there are a lot of Yamassee that are originally from there. So when they did go back, that was the end of that particular story. And one thing we don't find is a census record of how many actually left.